Welcome to the Life's Best Medicine podcast, where we are finding hope and healing one episode at a time. No appointment needed, no rubber gloves, and no copay. Just a healthy dose of life lessons to help equip you for this wild journey we call life. Hey everyone, this is a friendly reminder that we are here for entertainment purposes only. We may not even be that entertaining at times, but this is not medical advice. Talk to your doctor, check with your healthcare professionals before making any lifestyle changes or medicine changes. What we're talking about is our clinical experience and what we've seen. And so if you really want our advice, you can consult us. You can actually consult me as a doctor, or you can consult my guest and get all your questions answered. But we can't give free medical advice because we can't pay our bills with that, but we can help to educate you a bit and allow you to think a little bit. And always reach out to your medical professional before making any lifestyle changes. Thank you. Okay, everyone, you've been warned. It's now December. Man, you're in the middle of the minefield right now from a metabolic standpoint. So enjoy your holidays, whatever they may be. Enjoy your family. Take some time. Thanks for listening to the podcast. And again, I want to thank my sponsors, Keto Mojo, keto-mojo.com. They're doing great work. Their website's fantastic if you want to go there and get some new information. A lot of great talks are on there. So if you're trying to survive the holidays, that's a great resource. And of course, they help us by checking our ketone levels and sugars to make sure we're on track. So valuable tool. I use it with my patients who have a continuous glucose monitor to get a more accurate blood sugar level in case they're confused by some of the confounding factors that happen, like sitting in a jacuzzi, for instance, or laying on that sensor at night when you're sleeping. So Keto Mojo, they're doing some great work, great people. And of course, Health Code, great shakes, chocolate, macadamia, and vanilla. Tons of treats you can make for the holidays with them. They have tons of recipes on their website. So I'd recommend you go check them out at gethelp, GETHLTH.com. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your continued support. Enjoy this episode.
Discover a new path to wellness at Arizona Metabolic Health. Dr. Brian Lenzkes offers advanced medicine and personalized care, treating the root causes of your health concerns, not just the symptoms. Whether you're seeking direct primary care, effective diabetes management, or medical weight loss, with a holistic approach, our team is here to guide you every step of the way. Visit ArizonaMetabolicHealth.com today to learn more about our innovative health solutions.
Hello and welcome back to the Life's Best Medicine podcast. This is an exciting one for me. I know I say that all the time because I just love this stuff. But Dr. Andrew Koutnik, this is a Florida guy who's like exercise physiology guy, nutrition, and he's doing some great work. And he struggles with type 1 diabetes. I want to say he struggles with it because he's got this thing figured out pretty well. Dr. Koutnik, welcome, man. So great to have you.
It's a pleasure. We met recently for the first time in person, but we actually have spoken a couple times. Once at least on a podcast, and I know you peripherally for sure for a long period of time because of the various things you've done in the metabolic health space. So it's cool to be here.
No, I love it because I've been watching your posts and stuff. I was seeing them like, oh my goodness, because you have type 1 and doing it, like posting your tracings. Here's what happens when I exercise really hard. Here's when I just do zone 2 training. And it's so helpful because I think there's so much misinformation about type 1 diabetes and mismanagement across the board. And so your research is so critical, and obviously you have a vested interest because this affects your life.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll be honest with you. A lot of people, I remember when I first got into science, people were like, yeah, you can't be too overly biased or emotional towards what you do. And the reality is that everyone cares, is emotionally invested in what they do. If they don't, they probably wouldn't be doing it. It's too hard of a career and a path in research, and you typically don't get paid a whole hell of a lot to do it. So you really have to care about what you're doing, in my opinion. And when you do, everything just comes together. And so, yeah, I'm extremely passionate about this topic, especially the areas where I feel like are most unmet in the context of type 1 diabetes, because outcomes are not great, and the therapies are not moving the needle, at least not nearly enough. And so this has really been my passion to not only explore new options, but actually through my lived experience, try to translate that to real world application.
Yeah, and it's super helpful because I have a couple of young athletes who are type 1, and I see what their coaches saying, you got to drink Gatorade before practice so you don't get low sugars. You got to do that. And you look into what their sugars are doing on the continuous glucose monitor and think, oh my gosh, like this is totally mismanagement.
Yep. Well, so it's interesting you bring that up because it's often believed, especially in the context of sports, but this conversation extends beyond sports, that there's this idea that carbohydrates are obligate for maintaining health and safety in the context of type 1 diabetes, but actually that makes things way more difficult and actually much more complicated in many respects. And simplicity is actually lethal. Simplicity is can be a very powerful thing in managing type 1 diabetes. But ironically, like some of these preconceived conceptions about nutrition and what is and isn't ideal for nutrition, in my opinion, is actually the most paramount to talk about in the context of type 1 diabetes, and more so than any other disease. And I stand on that claim more than type 2 diabetes, more than a lot of these other conditions, just based on the impact food actually has in this disease. It's a first order principle. It is the most impactful in this disease more than others, and you see the 24-hour impact of it in glycemic control and insulin due to the tools that we have that have since merged into other diseases like CGMs, continuous glucose monitors. Those started in type 1 diabetes. Being able to monitor 24-hour insulin is not an option for virtually anyone unless you're in an advanced lab study. Well, that's readily available for the vast majority of patients. So you really see everything in how your body responds in type 1 diabetes, but you also lack the ability to metabolize endogenously carbohydrates. You lack that capability, and so you have to manually do this. And so it makes nutrition such an interesting topic, more so in this disease than maybe any, I would argue.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And that's something that we're around 24/7. I mean, unless we're sleeping, basically. And so, and it's hard. It's a tough thing. Let's step back for a second, just from a
Yeah.
personal perspective. Like when you were tell me the story about when you were diagnosed initially and like what went through your brain, how did it affect your family and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we were on a family trip and ended up getting sick. Was extremely lethargic, fatigued more than I'd ever been in my entire life. Was drinking, man, I think I drank somewhere around 14 glasses of water at a restaurant. The next day I had the pitchers they pour for multiple tables. I had two and a half of those and threw up for 14 hours straight, ended up in the hospital. And I was super dehydrated. I mean, it was getting pretty close to the point where it would have been probably lethal within 24 hours or so. And unfortunately, when patients don't detect this, that's what happens. But when I got in the hospital and I remember the doctor walked up to me, they do a little finger test, and I have no idea what tests they're doing. They say, we're going to run some tests, right? And you just trust them. And so I'm in the emergency room and they run some tests and they come back and they say, and keep in mind, I'm 16 years old, so I have no idea the relevance of any of this. I have no medical background or anything like that. And they come and say, your blood sugar is 596 milligrams per deciliter. And for those who don't know this, I'm sure most of your audience does, normal is probably, it is defined as 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. So if you take an average of that around 90, 95, we're talking, I was around 6 times higher than that. And so that had no relevance to me in any context. But they're like, hey, you have type 1 diabetes and you're going to have this for the rest of your life. And I honestly didn't hit me at all. Right. I'm like, okay, how soon do we get out of here? That seems important, but I have no idea the
Now I got a
implications of
vacation
that.
to get back to, right?
Yeah. Like I got to go home and play video games, man. Like, well, this is totally screwing my life up right now. Let's just get out of here.
And you were fit and
Um,
active. Have you always been active like you are now and fit, or did that change it when you get this diagnosis?
so I was actually obese as a kid. So I had adolescent obesity. So that I was kind of set up, not because and it was interesting. My parents were active athletes. We tried to always eat healthy, but I found myself being obese as a kid. And what was interesting is that I ended up losing that weight after failing for 5 or 6 years. And a year before this, I had come to a normal body weight and was stable. And so it was completely independent. At least I largely would be believed to be completely independent of one another. So it was actually a year later when I got diagnosed. So I was obese. I had lost weight. I had understood the impact nutrition and exercise could have on improving something like your weight and how you feel. But now I get diagnosed with this disease, which I'm rapidly learning in real time in the hospital that I'm going to have to be basically a world expert on lifestyle nutrition, because everything you do has an impact on your glycemic control. And they don't really, you don't really appreciate this until you live with it. But essentially what you find out pretty quickly is that, okay, nutrition is the most impactful right out the gate, and carbohydrates are the most impactful on your blood glucose. They teach you this thing called carbohydrate counting, where you give insulin for the amount of carbs you consume. They don't really tell you to pay attention to a whole lot else, because that's the most impactful. So focus on that. And then you learn everything. You have basically a master class, a 24/7 master class on how to manage your own disease. And I was in the ICU for 7 days, and the general hospital for another 7 days. So it's 2 weeks of like hardcore, all in multidisciplinary team teaching me what this meant for me. And I remember the day I walked out of the hospital and I go to eat breakfast at the hotel we were staying at the time. And I remember just looking at the menu and thinking, holy shit, man, I have to now be a expert on nutrition and understand everything that's in every single one of these food items. Like, how am I even going to choose what I want? And if I choose, then how many carbs is in this meal? According to what they're telling me, I need to know exactly the amount. And then I need to take a syringe out in public and inject myself with it, knowing everyone. I mean, I'm at an age now at 16 where everyone knows the stigma
Yeah,
around a syringe.
yeah. And you're at 16 and you're already going through, trying to fit in and awkwardness of
Exactly.
being,
Yeah.
all that high school stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. And I feel for kids now, especially diagnosed in early adolescence, or even before that, feeling like the pressure to fit in and then having a device. Luckily, these are a lot less. You're not necessarily having to pull a syringe. You can have insulin pumps. Some are a little more hidden. Like you can put them under certain parts of your clothes can cover them, or they have ones that look like pins instead of a syringe. Like they've done all these things to make the perception of it appear less um, crude and prickly, so to speak, or a little more overt. But even still, it doesn't change the fact that the disease and the burden of it is 24/7 and very profound. It is a 24/7 disease. You don't get a break. There is no cure for this disease. There likely will not be a cure for my disease. They may prevent it in the next few decades. I mean, I would think probably 33 decades out from something like that. But then you have to talk about, how do you fix the management of it for the people who already have it. So it's going to be here to stay for quite some time. The number of people with type 1 is expected to double over the next 10 years. So that all said, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like you just take a brick and slam it right in my face when I was sitting at that hotel in the morning thinking, man, this is forever. And I got depressed instantly. And that stuck with me for like 2 weeks. I thought, man, I'm stuck with this forever. And I didn't really appreciate it at the time, because it's more of the subtle subconscious impact that glycemic control has on you 24/7. But you start to realize over time, especially if you, with the tools that we have now to monitor glucose, monitor things like insulin all day, every day, that these values in glucose and load of insulin that's in your body at any particular moment directly impacts the way you feel at every moment. In fact, anyone who would debate this and say, oh, no, I feel fine in hyperglycemia, can go look up the verified symptoms of hyperglycemia in the medical literature. You go pick up any textbook. They're certified mental and physical health symptoms in both high and low end. And the vast majority of patients live in hyperglycemia 24/7. And only about 1% of patients actually achieve normal metabolic health, where they're living the vast majority of their life in normal metabolic control. It's extremely rare with the current standard of care technology and medications that patients are utilizing and implementing, which, in my opinion, is a straight tragedy. And I could go into that in extensive detail, but it shouldn't be that way, but it is.
Yeah, when you say that less than 1% have an A1C less than 5.7, and you go, wow, that means 99% are poorly controlled, right? And what you're saying is so true in type 2 diabetics. We've always known, we've seen this association or correlation with depression. And it turns out you wonder, like, these poorly controlled diabetics and they're depressed. You go, was it because the high sugars that cause them to be depressed, or they get depressed and didn't care anymore and got out of control? And it turns out the high sugars were the preceding factor. And then they got
That's
depressed after.
Yeah, and Brian, you bring up a great point, because in the context specifically of type 1 diabetes, where patients are typically were historically normal body weight, now they're actually becoming obese at the same rates the general population is, but historically were under body weight, didn't have high adiposity levels, didn't have high things like high lipids and amino acids in their blood, like in the context of type 2, they essentially just lost the insulin producing beta cells to control their glucose levels. So the one thing that changes amongst everything that's going on, the one major discrepancy between for a patient with type 1 diabetes versus not is dysglycemia. And now you're having to manually manage it with exogenous insulin for the rest of your life. So dysglycemia is the cornerstone discrepancy between some person who doesn't have type 1 and someone who does. And we see that the diagnosis of psychiatric disorders goes, the data is most consistently showing about 2 to 5-fold increase in diagnoses post diagnosis with type 1 diabetes, not pre, post. And what that seems to suggest very strongly, because of all the data on metabolic health and dysglycemia and mental health, is there must be some association or implications of dysglycemia. But you look no further than looking at hyperglycemia symptoms and realize that these are mental health symptoms. And most patients are living there, not just at, the average glucose control of a patient with type 1 is about 180 milligrams per deciliter if you look at average HbA1cs. But they're actually their variability is bigger than any other disease. The variability in glucose is typically average blood glucose about 180, with a standard deviation of 60 milligrams per deciliter above and 60 below. But the total range means that their fluctuation in glucose is, on average, in the patient, over 120 milligrams per deciliter every day. And their average just happens to be in hyperglycemia. And so, yeah, there would be huge implications of that. And there are. And I can tell you, as someone living with this disease, the implications of high, low, and variable blood sugar levels are just so crystal clear. If I eat something that I thought was, low sugar, or, a lot of people in this audience may appreciate this, or especially if you have type 1, you can't hide from sugar. You see it when it's present. So a lot of these, foods and other things that they claim are keto or low sugar, frankly not. That's number one. But two, when you eat them, and let's say I have an issue with insulin administration through one of the insulin pods, or let's say that my CGM is misreading, and either way, so I ended up going high inadvertently, maybe through no fault of my own, and through mislabeling on food or something along those lines. And then I'm in the process of having to give myself a pretty decent insulin bolus to bring it down. That change in insulin, one, from feeling high, you start feeling these subtle symptoms of irritability. You can feel fatigued. You can feel, it's just, you're not your best self, right? I'm not my best self when I'm there. And that drop, when you go from a high blood glucose down, it reminds me of like these rare moments of high anxiety I've had in my life, where I can feel like something's happening and I feel really anxious about it. That's what actually the drop in blood sugar feels like, because we're not talking drops of like 50 milligrams per deciliter, Brian. We're talking like 100 milligrams per deciliter. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
profound changes in glucose levels over very short intervals of time.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is this rapid up, and this is what we're seeing in type 2s. We're eating terrible stuff and drinking sodas and Slurpees and all that all day, and cookies. And you see this up and down, and then they're
Yeah.
agitated. And it's amazing how many doctors say, yeah, food has nothing to do with mood. Like, look at hyperglycemia side effect. Look at the symptoms, and you go, wait a
Yeah.
minute. Or hypoglycemia. Are you kidding me? As a matter of fact, I've seen gosh, we could talk forever, but as a quick anecdote for you, I have a lady that they were totally mismanaging her sugars, and I go, she needs to see, and she was in her 78 years old, right? She's not a spring chicken. And like I'm looking at her med list, I'm like, oh my gosh, they were gonna put her in a nursing home, like basically hospice, because she was having panic attacks all day. She was having all these issues. And so what they were doing basically once I got a CGM on her and the family was arguing against it, they said the doctor says she doesn't need that. She's not on insulin. I go, let's see, because she's on glipizide. She was on glipizide, right? This poor thing was getting hypoglycemic and then having panic from the hypoglycemia, and they're giving her Xanax 3 times a day for panic attacks. Once we got her on a low carb ketogenic diet and even that out, no more Xanax, no more panic attacks. She's walking, she's exercising again, she's doing something. Her whole life changed by getting her off these meds that were causing hypoglycemia that they were missing because they were just doing finger sticks.
Yeah, Brian, and it's interesting, like you know, we talk about, or I often talk about, because I live with this disease, you know, what we learn from type 1 really applies to everything. You're just kind of an insulin knockout model with the ability to understand how everything in your life affects glucose and insulin. You quickly realize that, and you quickly realize why metabolism is so complicated. You know, it's because you see, you know, just man, waking up, the time of day, the how much sleep did you get? What's your level of physical activity, and it could just be walking for 10 to 15 minutes, and the change and how the insulin affects you, how your blood glucose changes, how it interacts with food, and all these factors interplay together, where you can often find that what happens at one meal on one day is almost the ability to replicate that the next day almost feels impossible, because there's
Mm-hmm.
so many variables that move in metabolism that affects insulin sensitivity and also glucose control. But that's right in the forefront of your brain, and you see it very clearly if you pay attention at all with type 1 diabetes. But you bring up a really, I think, important point that I'm a big believer, Brian, that everyone could be in this top 1%. I don't feel like people need to feel like that's not achievable. It's 100% achievable for people to get into this elite metabolic health in the context of a disease like type 1 diabetes. The problem is that most people are not aware of the tools and strategies that allow them to get there. You know, I feel pretty lucky in that I've been very passionate about health and nutrition due to being obese as a kid, and then kind of really paying attention to all these different things to optimize my health, then my disease when I ended up getting type 1 diabetes. But all this was centered around originally performance for me. And so I paid attention to a lot of these little nuanced details, and I learned a lot from that. And what I actually learned with living with the disease of type 1 diabetes taught me as much or maybe more than I learned in going through medical school. So I'm not a medical doctor, I'm a PhD, but we took the same courses. And you'll real or many of the same courses from a very biologic centric mindset. And what I learned, some of the most valuable things I learned from research and ideas and innovative approaches for research actually came from this disease, because you learn like all this stuff about insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. Like I can write a list out right now what my lived experience was. I can go in the literature and say, yep, those things align with insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. Oh wait, but these other things affect me too, and those haven't really had enough literature. Let's look at that too. You know, and so you learn so much from this disease. But I feel lucky in that I was passionate, particularly about this topic, and then ultimately went on to research it, because what that gave me, or to not only get advanced knowledge on it and training, but then I ultimately research it. And what that really gave me, Brian, was an ability to take what I saw and lived experience and give biological explanations to why it was happening. And
I love
that
it,
then
man.
allowed.
That's what we're supposed to do, right? Like Tro and I were noticing stuff go, huh? We're treating diabetes and their mood's getting better. And then we said that, ooh, I got attacked for 3 days for that, right? On social media. They go, has nothing to do with it. I'm like, well, we have enough data that it does. And people are we're seeing it. We're not making it up. We're seeing people happy again. And we're like, that's the best side effect we could possibly get, you know? So and now we're seeing they're using metabolic stuff to help people with depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, and you name it, right? And you go, oh my gosh, this all comes back to metabolic disease.
And it also gives people an opportunity to understand and consider it as an approach. You know, a lot of the it's important for a lot of the audience members to appreciate this. I'm actively involved in research. I've been funded by Department of Defense and National Institutes of Health and all these other arenas. And we've conducted, long-term randomized controlled trials. We have done acute interventions. This could span from people with very complex metabolic disease all the way to elite level operational individuals. We've been funded. We've worked with NASA on projects before. We've been funded by Special Operations Command, all this stuff. And what you pretty quickly learn is that, in the medical literature, when you do these research questions, you're setting up the experiment to very specifically design and understand a question. So, and what I typically do from a researcher vantage point, and I like to approach research as what question could we ask that would actually advance our understanding, but what value add does it have to the end user? Whether that be a patient trying to improve their disease outcomes and management, or let's say a high level operational person with elite level performance who wants to get that 1% edge that could in some cases mean winning or losing, or in the context of military personnel, life or death, right? So these are the things that are on the table. But you also have to research from a research vantage point. When you do these studies, what is it actually telling you? And you have to just understand there's always limitations in scope, and actually understanding how these studies are designed and how to interpret them is a very difficult thing. The vast majority of people are, I'm not saying ill-equipped to do so. It's just the way that it's done is very difficult. And that's why it's really important to have people help translate very complex, often complex science and demystify it, honestly, for how to apply it to the average person, to allow individuals to have access to information that might have been exclusive to a few people here or there who often don't talk about it. They don't get on podcasts like this and go share about it. But that needs to be more common. And either way, I'm very passionate about that topic, but it is important to appreciate that, science is often complex. It's hard to interpret. You do have to find trustful sources, but I really encourage people to get out there and share their information as much as they can, especially if they have tools and strategies that might help patients along their journey.
It is so critically important. And that's why I'm so excited talking to you. Just talking to you beforehand, I get like in my brain, I'm thinking, okay, you're doing like Ben Bickman, massive influence, just the research he did. And I'm looking at his stuff going, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing clinically. And he's already done the work, right? So he's showing that, before you get diabetes, your A1C and type 2 diabetes, I'm talking about, your A1C and sugar look fine. But for 15 years, your insulin's going up and up and up and not working. You're getting this insulin resistance. I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm seeing. And so I got so excited. I reached out to him. He goes, Brian, no one talks about that. No doctors are talking about what I'm doing. And it is so frustrating because I have all this information that can save lives, but he's not a treating physician. Like no one's doing it. So once that starts catching on and people start realizing, oh, so this stuff you're doing is so that's why I was so mind blown by seeing your response to exercise or stress or not sleeping and all that. And I go, oh, okay, that's why my type 2s aren't doing well if they're stressed, intense, and hate the world, even if they're eating a perfect ketogenic diet. So if you're type 1, and this is something we run into in my line, is people come in and they go, my kid has type 1, we're not giving him any insulin, we're going to control it just with diet. I was like, well, if you have no insulin to shut down the glucagon effect or the gluconeogenesis, your sugars can go crazy high. So it's a scary thing. You really got to balance it out. Ryan, I would love to hear your take on that. Like if you're getting as basically, and before we get too carried away, we got to talk about your case studies on you, right?
Yeah.
Because these I was looking at as like, keeping your A1C in that range for so long, for 10 years on a ketogenic diet defined as less than 50 grams of carbs. And you see the effect it has. And the frustrating thing is when I was reading this, I was thinking how many kids they're six, like your situation, they get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and the family goes, you know what? It's too restricted to do that ketogenic diet stuff. Let's just let him eat what he wants and we'll just shoot him with insulin. And then they become obese with insulin resistance as a type 1, which we'd never seen before. And so that's something that I'm sure you come up against is people go, let kids be kids and let them eat pizza and cake and ice cream.
Yeah. So that's probably one of the most controversial topics in type 1 diabetes. And I'm happy to go right into that as someone who's, yeah, because I think this is critical and people won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, but it's just, it's important to move the field forward. Number one, that information is true. If you were to change your lifestyle, often changing means you have to adjust something. And in many respects, depending on how you look at it, that could be felt as restrictive or empowering. But you have to first understand what you already have in the context of the disease. Number one, you're set up for the average outcomes in patients with type 1 diabetes is lived chronic hyperglycemia. So the lived effect of chronic hyperglycemia, let's say you're a parent and worried about your child. And what I'm speaking about is not, this is a lived experience of patients who have type 1 diabetes and ultimately the evidence as it stands today, Brian. So obviously everything could change over the next 5-10 years, but here's where we stand today. Here's the best information we understand. Poor glycemic control, which is the case in 99% of patients, if you consider it as defined as not having normal metabolic control, is associated with growth deceleration. So the lack of growth over time. So patients with type 1 diabetes typically have reduced growth. That's number one. Number two, we know that we see changes in neural anatomy associated with dysglycemia within the first 4 years of life in a patient and in kids with type 1 diabetes. So when you first get diagnosed, there's this basically almost every study ever done looking at IQ in kids have shown reduced IQ with patients with type 1 diabetes. And you may ask, why? Why would kids have reduced IQ consistently with this disease? Also, why would they also show signs of early atherosclerotic progression, even in adolescence within the first 4 years of diagnosis compared to their peers? How is that happening in kids? Well, if you look at all of these different tissue-specific changes, you see that all of them are associated with glycemic control, and it's dose-dependent, these associations, meaning the higher the glycemic control, meaning the poorer the metabolic health, the worse the change is. And so there were some really interesting studies that attempted to answer why that is occurring. And in the context of the brain, even in kids with type 1 diabetes, what you see is if you actually monitor over a longitudinal period of time, there's studies that have done this in controlled trials doing MRI scans of the brains of children with type 1 and found that if you actually look at neuroanatomical changes in their matched peers, at first kids with type 1 diabetes, you see that the kids with the highest levels of glucose, highest and variable levels of glucose, actually appear to have neuroanatomical delays in development in the brain. What we also see is that when patients even have marginal improvements from, let's say, an 8.5% HbA1c to just like a 0.5% improvement, which is nowhere near normal, but just a slight improvement, we see that it starts to improve the neural anatomy of the brain. So even these slight improvements in glycemic control to start to counteract these negative impacts in neuroanatomy. And this is what we understand today. And so it's important to your original question to appreciate that what we're doing today with the average outcomes we're seeing is actually causing health-related complications. And so you have to start by understanding that's where it starts. So if you were to do something that could feel, I don't know, restrictive to a degree, but you dramatically improve these risk factors that lead or are strongly associated with these adverse outcomes, what's the trade-off here? Because you are almost accepting that growth deceleration, number one. You're accepting these lower IQs. You're accepting this atherosclerotic progression. In fact, all patients with type 1 diabetes within their lifetime are, quote, in the scientific literature, expected to get a long-term complication. That is expected. That is the norm. And so if you were to do something like, I don't know, reduce carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are the most potent impact on postprandial hyperglycemia in a dose-dependent manner, and have more stable blood glucose control, is it really that restrictive? Or is the possibility of guaranteed complications, impaired growth, early atherosclerotic progression, more of a restriction to your life? And I would argue that's kind of a no-brainer. Obviously, I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but this is lived reality. This is what patients are set up to have. And this is such a controversial topic. How dare you imply that I can't eat certain foods? Like, you can eat whatever you want. But you also have to accept that in the context of type 1 diabetes, living in dysglycemia has poor outcomes. Full stop. And that expands the spectrum. If you're an athlete who has type 1 diabetes, we know that that's associated with inability to blunted VO2 max, which is obviously associated with long-term health and outcomes. We also know that the vast majority of studies that have been conducted in patients with type 1 are in hyperglycemia. So the question is, what even happens if you're going from normal to slight hyperglycemia? And actually, the first paper I've actually seen to even attempt to answer this came out last year, which showed just being in normal versus being even slightly elevated within this accepted time and range for type 1 diabetes, which I put quotes around because it's not normal. It's just what's accepted from the medical community, actually leads to the inability to clear lactate as efficiently. So then what that would demonstrate, if you can't clear it as efficiently and you lead to higher levels of lactate during exercise, is that you're likely going to hit fatigue earlier. And so there's all these reasons why dysglycemia or outside the norm is so clearly associated with adverse outcomes. And so it just makes so much sense to do what you can to improve that as much as you can with the tools you have available. But unfortunately, the tools we have right now do not reliably get patients into that range.
Yeah, and that's a problem. It's like you're excuse me, you're a unicorn in that like less than 1% of people have good. So how do you study something when it's so rare to be in good control, right? It's until we fix that problem, we're never going to know what normal, what it should be, what your longevity should be. And that's why your study is so important, because people are saying, well, you shouldn't be in long-term ketosis. Well, like, I did hear it for 10 years, studied, what were the ill effects and what are the outcomes? And I think part of it looking at, I love that you went and did the repeat analysis on your second paper, looking at the cardiovascular response to the 10 years of a ketogenic diet. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you came up with on that.
For your audience to understand the research question we tried to answer, the papers you're referencing is we knew, so we had conducted a systematic review of all studies ever conducted in the context of type 1 diabetes, and that paper I'm hoping will come out soon. I think that's maybe the most important paper I've ever done in the context of my lived scientific experience. However, I also knew when looking at that there was no study that had looked at even a low carbohydrate diet defined as less than 130 grams per day had done any serious long-term longitudinal assessment of the impact of that type of diet. And we're talking ketogenic. I mean, we're just talking like low carb. And so I knew there was a complete absence of data basically beyond the 1 to 2 year mark. In fact, the only case report that at least said that they had been on a diet for that period of time was 4 years, but they had no confirmation that that was true. And there was no pre-data versus post. It was just, hey, this was post, and I'm telling you I was on it for 4 years. And so what we found was very interesting is we knew of a patient who happened to have type 1 diabetes and actually was on the American Diabetes Association diet for the first, I believe, 6 years of, not believe, it was first 6 years of their lived experience with type 1 diabetes, and then switched to a ketogenic diet due to the potential hypothetical benefits on their health, disease, and performance, maintained that with their body composition, their caloric intake, and kept their medical management strategy the exact same for an entire decade. So to find longitudinal data in the context of a ketogenic diet that is 10 years in duration with pre to post data, with confirmation from a DEXA scan, pre to post, lipids, HbA1cs throughout, is frankly unheard of. And it's definitely unheard of to ever have any level of control over the confounding variables that we know influence metabolic health and cardiovascular disease, such as medication, calories, and body composition. That patient is me, Brian. And so what the reason we did this and wanted to do this is because I know I had all this data. I was in research, and so I knew that I had a DEXA scan, I had DEXA scans, and I had pre to post, and I had all this data, and I knew I had controlled because I had eating logs, I had exercise logs. So I knew I had controlled my activity over a 10-year period. It was the same. I knew I had a DEXA scan pre to post. Like, you can't make these things up. Everything was controlled. And so the question was, we don't know what the long-term implications of this ketogenic diet are in the medical literature. In fact, the longest ever report, historically speaking, with pre to post data was in GLUT1 deficiency disorder, a neurological disorder where we know that in neurological domains such as seizures and GLUT1 deficiency, that these diets have been used for quite a long period of time. And so there was the longest ever report ever, Brian, was 10 years. But there was never a longitudinal report of that duration with these types of controls, or even without these types of controls with a ketogenic diet, looking at advanced measures of cardiovascular health. Because one of the hypothesized concerns is that if you were to go on a ketogenic diet, that you would have high LDL, which does almost universally occur, and at least it gets higher. It might not be like absorbently high in everyone, although in some it does. And so what would be the cardiovascular risk? But we also looked at other measures that are of concern for patients with type 1 diabetes, which is like bone mineral density. People with type 1 diabetes have reduced bone mineral density, increased risk for injury. We also looked at liver function, kidney function, adverse events. A lot of the concerns we've all in ketogenic diet is that if you go hypoglycemia, you'll have increased incidence of severe hypoglycemia. You'll have more DKA incidents because if you're on a ketogenic diet, aren't you at risk for going into diabetic ketoacidosis more so? And so we answered all of these questions by looking at medical
And you
health
looked at
records.
thyroid too, right?
Yes. So we also looked
Thyroid
at an advanced thyroid panel and not only so I had more than what we actually reported, but because reviewers wanted a clean pre to post longitudinal data. So patients individuals are interested. We have way more data than this, but we just pulled the ones we had medical verified pre to post data on both biomarkers, and that was medical records. So this is independent of me just saying, oh, like this is what happened. No, like we pulled my medical records, we reviewed them, and this is what happened pre to post. As objective as you can get in this type of a setting, being a case report, right? An individual who did this, because we have no other data on this. And what we found was that not only did bone mineral density not decline despite 10 years of aging, it actually stayed exactly the same, despite being on a ketogenic diet. We also found that kidney and liver function were maintained, again, despite having a disease that reliably deteriorates. Deteriorates kidney health and has impacts potentially on liver health. It's hypothesized that thyroid function may be disrupted, although the data is very mixed on that. And there was no meaningful change in thyroid hormone levels or biomarkers. And the more important and pertinent than any of that as well was the long-term cardiovascular implication, because this was the real novelty of this report that I thought got particular attention, because all of this hype and interest around LDL cholesterol and its potential or lack their association with atherosclerotic progression on specifically a ketogenic diet. And so we tested that, but we tested that not just doing something like a calcium score, which is the gold standard. A calcium score is the gold standard, but that's something you would expect further down the road. Although you can see changes in calcium scores in people with type 1 diabetes as early as their 30s. So unfortunately, but what we wanted to look at are the early signs. So we know that there's measurements that I've actually assessed in a research setting for over a decade, things that look at vascular function and health, stuff like arterial stiffness, like how fast is the blood moving through the vascular wall? And that tells us, is the vascular wall compliant and elastic, or is it more collagenic and stiff? And it becomes more stiff in a response to higher blood pressures and stress and inflammation. And that makes sense, right? Just like if you lift weights, your muscles get bigger and stronger. Yeah. If you have higher pressures against your vascular wall, it gets stiffer and harder. So you can test that. You can also test how the vascular wall is elastic in response to shear stress. So how the blood is moving through the vascular wall. And we assessed both of these amongst others, as well as left ventricular heart function, because all of these deteriorate within 4 years of diagnosis, even in kids. So they were the early signs of the indications that atherosclerotic progression was occurring. And when we looked at those measurements, we found that not only were this patient being myself, I maintained a mean HbA1c, a median HbA1c of 5.5% over a 10-year period, despite elevated LDL the entire time, and despite not taking any medications to lowering it, and also despite maintaining my insulin regimen over that period of time, so it's lower insulin. We found that not only did my measurements were they better than people on average for age matched, disease matched, sex matched measurements across the board on these measures, but they often sometimes outcompeted or better than people without type 1 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is a disease where cardiovascular disease is progressive and accelerating much more rapid than in the general population. And so to find that not only was it better than people with type 1 on average, but it was better oftentimes than people without type 1 diabetes, gave an indication at the very least that there is potentially a tool with profound clinical therapeutic benefit that may help patients be not only equivalent or potentially better than their peers who are struggling, who don't have this disease. And that's the ultimate goal upon diagnosis, is for you to be able to wake up. You get diagnosed one day. Let's say your kid get diagnosed, or someone's listening's kid just gets diagnosed. The first thing you want to do is go to the doctor and be reassured that they could have the same health and longevity and thrive just like their peers. And right now, that's not an option. But what we were trying to illustrate is that there are therapeutic strategies that appear to have profound clinical benefit that need greater levels of investigation and appreciation, frankly, based on where we stand today on the evidence base, where most patients are expected to have long-term adverse clinical outcomes over their lifespan. And so this is, in my opinion, based on where we stand today, this is an critically important evaluation, and should be prompting a lot of people to look around and wonder, okay, this whole diet thing, what's this about?
I think you raised so many huge questions. That's why I'm excited about your data too. And the other thing we didn't even mention, you decrease your insulin usage by 43% over that time, which if you were on the standard American diet or the ADA's diet, you would have markedly increased because you would have become insulin resistant during that same time period, right? Of eating a bunch of carbohydrates. So then you're shooting more and more insulin to get the same effect. And so that's one huge point. And the other one is, I'm just looking at, like, I was thinking about when we were talking about when you lower the sugars really quickly. So, for instance, clinically, if I have someone whose systolic blood pressure is 220 for the last year and, over 160 or something crazy, if I lower it to normal, they're going to feel like garbage. Like their body is not, you have to adjust for those kind of things. Right? You have to slowly bring it down. You don't want to, if you have hyponatremia, if you have low sodium, you don't just replace it right away and like, let's just tank this guy because they have, a brain injury and all these things that happen. But the other important point, I'd be really curious about this, is with type 1s, the biggest concern people have is hypoglycemia, symptomatic hypoglycemia. So I'm wondering if during your 10 years of doing this, did you ever experience hypoglycemia, like glucose low, but asymptomatic from the standpoint of you're running on ketones? Like, I don't know if you saw Cahill's study way back in the day when he took
Correct.
people
Yeah.
and put them on a ketogenic diet forever and then just tank their sugars down to 26 and they're walking around like nothing happened. The rest of us would be dead.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's actually a clinical trial in Harvard right now with a collaborator of mine who's actually trying to do that in a randomized controlled setting to answer that. But my own personal lived experience is, one, the data actually showed that for myself, that I spent 0% of the time in severe hypoglycemia. Now, which is the one most people are very concerned about, where symptoms are near ubiquitous. You have lower cognition and it affects how you feel pretty profoundly. The thing is, the question mark is a number of things. Number one, so that was the case there. Also, the same was the case on hyperglycemia end. So it was the mean glucose was actually median glucose was 99 milligrams per deciliter. The standard deviation, I forget the exact number. I think it was like 2021. Is my own data. I should know this, but it was low. It's 3 times lower than the average patient with type 1. And so what that means is much tighter glycemic control. Now, here's the thing: is so a lot of patients, it depends on a number of factors here, Brian, but in my own personal experience, what I've found is that when I've gone on this diet, I was able to maintain a very tight glycemic control while also being able to detect hypo. So I can tell you exactly how it feels the entire time throughout that 10 years when I got hypo, because when I would go hypo, it almost felt like the clouds were coming over my head. It was like, imagine you're having a sunny day And then, all of a sudden these clouds just come over you and it gets dark and it gets gloomy. That is in essence the analogy I provide when you get hypo. And so, yes, I was keenly aware of when I would go hypo, typically less than 70 milligrams per deciliter. However, it wasn't profound. It wasn't like, boom, it hits you like a ton of bricks
Like
to your
shaky and
face.
confused and sweating and all that, like we
No,
typically would
nowhere
see.
near. No, definitely
Yeah.
nowhere near that. And there is this data that suggests that patients in elevated levels of ketosis can supplement brain energy needs during hypos, or not during hypos, but in the context of George Cahill, though that was in the lower available glucose level. They weren't hypoglycemic, but it was lower available glucose. And of course, the experiment you're talking about is when he took patients who were in full-fledged nutritional ketosis, injected them with insulin, and brought their glucose down levels down to the 20s of 20 milligrams per deciliter, where most patients would get a coma, and they were asymptomatic. And so I'm not recommending anyone with type 1 go on a ketogenic diet and inject themselves that much insulin to test
Yeah,
this
sure.
theory out. But I will say this is that that's an interesting question. I have intact hypoglycemic awareness, which is something that a lot of patients lose over time due to going into chronic levels of
Mm.
hypoglycemia. Um, Now that said, I've also found that when you get low, there is an open question that I think is what hopefully will be answered here soon from the group I was referencing, where is the thing that drives symptomatology towards hypoglycemia, the stress response, actually due to a set point in glycemia at a certain level, being like, let's say, 70 milligrams per deciliter. We know it's variable across patients, by the way. It's not
Mhm.
the same. Um, or is it actually due to a brain energy status, right? And that's actually not an answered question. But I found for myself, I maintained ketosis of around 0.3 to 1.5. Typically, 1.5 was later in the day. 0.3 is upon waking. And so, obviously, with type 1 diabetes, it's, if you do a diet that maintains normal glycemia, it's not a cure. Okay. You're still on
Mhm.
insulin, you still have the disease. And so you still have to manage the 40 plus factors that completely changes your insulin sensitivity and glucose levels every day. And so you're not eliminating all chances of hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia. You're dramatically lowering the risk and putting yourself in a position to be successful by lowering the amount of influx of glucose and the amount of insulin that has to be in the system at all times, because when you start changing things like physical activity and otherwise, you're basically magnifying the impacts of insulin, and you're also just dealing with bigger numbers. So as changes happen, bigger changes occur. So it's just riskier. So it's a roundabout way of saying that yes, I still have intact hypoglycemia. We actually assess that through an actual verified test, and I do have that, and I have always had it. I mean, I can very clearly tell you when I go low, when I feel it, but it's interesting when people describe how they feel and like just going below 80 when they typically live higher glucose levels. Their parent set point for when they feel hypoglycemia gets higher and higher, and that has been clinically reported. I typically have to get sub 70, and I'm aware of it, but I'm not debilitated by any means.
So you have
And
time to think and say, okay, how do I adjust? What do I adjust here? What do I have to do to bring it back up, right?
Correct. So to your point about awareness of hypoglycemia, definitely have awareness of hypoglycemia. There's no doubt about it. Do ketones help? I think there is a possibility of that they may be mitigating the incidence and or the level at which full-fledged the magnitude and severity of symptoms occur. But that's also an open question. We actually see this in athletes. We did a recent study that will be published soon, looking at athletes where we're trying to push them to the hitting the wall, where they actually got hypoglycemia. And what you find is that it is a key determinant of performance, number one. But we also found that when we're
These are
getting to the
type 1 athletes?
I know. So
No, no, these not type 1. Okay.
these are
This is just,
highly competitive
yeah, competitive. Yeah,
non-type
yeah,
1 triathletes.
yeah.
So it's interesting. The idea of this diet, we talk about type 1, and it's an interesting story here from a clinical benefit, because man, the 99% of patients don't see what's potentially possible with these dietary strategies to achieve normal glycemia. But these idea of a diet also is relevant in the context of performance in other settings. where we have actually done analysis looking at how things like hypoglycemia can affect athletic performance. I mean, we've known that for over 100 years that things like hypoglycemia directly impacts how people perform and feel. But what we found is that on these lower carbohydrate strategies, that patients were not more symptomatic at lower glucose levels, which but they had elevated ketones, which again alludes to this idea that ketones are providing some type of buffer in brain energy needs that may be mitigating the incidence of functional and performance declines that are characteristic of the symptoms of hypoglycemia. So the data is certainly in favor of that being the case. It'll be interesting to see when these more rigorous randomized controlled trials come out to actually look at said effect, where you actually push people down. But yeah,
Yeah,
so that's
I
it.
would love that. And what I would love is, I'm sure you know who Zach Bitter is,
Yeah,
the
of course, yeah.
longest. I would be so interesting, man. I don't know that he's ever done it, but it would be so interesting to check his labs right before the race and right after a 100-mile race or whatever he runs and see what his LDL cholesterol does, what his triglycerides do, and ketones and all these things. It would be really interesting to see the effects of that strenuous exercise for that long of a period of time. Just see because it look you. I would think you would look like you're on death's door after a race like that.
So yeah, a lot of our research over the last few years is also focused on elite level performance or high end performance, and there's a lot of literature actually, Brian, actually pointing to the idea that you look like you just got hit by a nuke after some of these races. You're not the epitome of health in your biomarkers. You look like you just
Yeah,
got destroyed biologically after a race like this. So
because you
obviously,
did, because you
yeah,
did,
100%.
and your body's
Yes,
trying to
yes,
compensate for everything, right? Yeah.
correct. Yep.
So the LDL response must be crazy on that, I would think.
No, I'm actually not as familiar with the LDL end outcome. In fact, I would actually suspect it might be a bit lower. Although in his case, it's very unique. So if you think about
Yeah,
him,
yeah,
he's
he's
a
unique.
very long duration athlete. But when you're doing something that's so energetically demanding, you wouldn't necessarily expect for this. Well, here, I'm just you
Yeah,
know,
hypothetically, what you would reason based on what you know,
yeah,
right?
what I would reason is that you would suspect that you're utilizing all available substrates for energetic need. Okay, so you would think that a lot of the circulating nutrients and or stored tissues are going to start being utilized and depleted in every way possible. So if any of these substrates can then be like glucose or like lactate or amino acids or otherwise can be utilized in any form of energy or energy use, you would suspect that they would. And individuals like Zach are also supplementing during the race, obviously, because your body's ability to maintain something like 100 miles is certainly, in theory, possible, but it's not optimal to give yourself nothing and rely only on endogenous sources for that
Yeah.
duration of a race. And we see that actually when asking people during hitting the wall. So we ask them to go to hit the wall, and we find that that hypoglycemia is a key determinant factor of performance. So, and keep in mind that just being low carbohydrate does not mean that you're not at risk for hypoglycemia. By the way, there are
Hmm.
ways in which the body actually is going to uptake glucose independent of insulin, and so it's not. So this is coming out soon, so I can only speak in vague
Oh,
terms.
we'll have you back to talk about this. Yes, I
Yeah,
know, but I'm excited about that because I think it's critically important information.
yeah, because a lot of the studies historically have said, no, so just taking performance from a 30,000 foot view, it's often believed that performance will decline on these lower carbohydrate diets. And most of the evidence around that has been in shorter duration diets with other confounding variables. When a lot of the studies that we have conducted have controlled body composition, activity, calories, and actually use the same subject and done crossover studies. So it's controlled as you get. And we see to date, no performance declines when patients are able to adapt to the diet long enough. So over the 4 weeks in duration. And that includes even very high intensity forms of exercise. But we also recently done an analysis where we asked individuals to go to very prolonged, high intense exercise like a marathon or like a long duration exercise endurance event. Some of these athletes were going for 4 hours to ultimately hit what is called the wall, something that was defined over 100 years ago in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1921, where they found that athletes would almost look deathly, almost like ghostly in the face with their color drawn out. and were incoherent at the end of a race, well, that was hypoglycemia. They discovered
Mm,
that 3 years
mhm.
later when they did lab tests on the individuals. So um, what we wanted to understand is if you compare low versus high carbohydrate diets in that context, one, would it automatically lead to performance deterioration, as would be expected by the current dogma in exercise physiology by going low carb, if they adapted to the diet long enough, at least 4 weeks? And number two, is hypoglycemia altered between low and high carbohydrate diets? So I'll just leave that cliffhanger and just say we actually found some unprecedented findings in that regard, and actually implemented carb supplementation as a arm to see does carb supplementation actually improve performance as would be expected on both these diets. And suffice it to say, we had some pretty unexpected findings in that regard that
Now
I
I'm looking
think will
forward to
be
that. I'm looking forward
very
to that.
interesting.
That would be really, that's something that hasn't been answered. So these are all key factors. And like, so I have to ask you, okay, I'm a 16-year-old kid. I come to you, I just got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and stressed out and all that. What kind of advice would you give to that person and his family or her family?
Well, number one, anything's possible. This idea that you're going to be beholden to long-term kind of trials and tribulations of highs and lows for the rest of your life is absolutely something that you should not accept. You can achieve the top 1%, not only in your disease management but also in life and performance. Everyone can achieve that. You just need to understand the right tools and strategies on how to get there. That would be first and foremost. Now, if they were to ask, well, how do I even attempt to get to a place like that? Well, you lay out the list of options. Okay, look, there's all these continuous glucose monitors, which can help you track your glucose levels. There's these insulin pumps if you don't want to have to inject your insulin every day. Oh, there's also these hybrid closed loop technologies, which actually take CGMs, link using a computer algorithm to automatically administer insulin based on your glucose levels. Now, that's an amazing tool in type 1 diabetes, and really is believed to be the next generation therapeutic strategy. But I would also inform that patient that we know that those studies do not allow for the vast majority of people on them to reach even the ADA targets in glycemic control, less than 7%, or even up to 70% between of their time glycemic control between 70 and 180 milligrams per deciliter. So I would not falsely present this idea that these tools and strategies are just going to get you there. That's false, untrue, and not what we're seeing in the literature whatsoever, or even practically in real life. I would say you have a choice, but it means you have to do things in a way that you learn from your lived experience. Go out, live your life, and come back and tell me, what do you think has the biggest impact on causing you the hardest struggles in maintaining normal glycemic control and ultimately feeling your best? Almost inevitably, they will come back with an answer I could have already given them, which is, what are the key hierarchical factors in glycemic control? We know that diet, specifically carbohydrates, is one of them. So the question is, okay, well, how would you regulate or alter that in such a way that allows you to feel your best? Is that as high as possible? Secret, probably not, Brian. Or is
Mhm.
it titrating it to the degree which is necessary to make you feel your best? And that's almost, we've done analysis looking at all studies ever conducted in the context of type 1 diabetes, and the evidence clearly demonstrates that your reliability of getting optimal glycemic control, even normal glycemia, which is unheard of in type 1 diabetes, is achievable when you lower carbohydrates sufficiently. And so I would not pretend that you can eat whatever you want and just bolus for it. That is a complete false narrative that leads patients to potentially be misrepresented on the reality of the disease they have. Kind of like telling someone with a peanut allergy, hey, look, you can sprinkle these peanuts in throughout and it should be okay. That's just not setting themselves
And
up
take
for
prednisone. Take prednisone to keep the allergy down, right? You go, just don't eat the peanuts.
yeah, and people would get outraged by me even attempting to describe such a thing. But this is the reality: is that the data clearly demonstrate this. Are people able to achieve normal glycemic control without doing things like ketogenic diets? Yes, but is it reliable? No, and that patients should know this. So if you want to eat a super high carbohydrate based diet and get normal glycemia, people do this. But there's things and strategies that people do to achieve that that you would have to also do. And the level of a big philosophy I have when thinking of these diseases and trying to achieve what I believe is performance-based diabetes management is the idea that think about what is the lowest hanging fruit that helps you achieve your personal individualized goals. And it's pretty clearly the ones you should go after first. And then you can consider the other more nuanced factors along the way. But in the context of type 1 diabetes, all these tools and technologies, they're great. They're going to make a big difference. And they're definitely going to help improve your quality of life. And they may help you improve your glycemic control a little bit. But in and of itself, will not. And so you need to understand the other variables like carbohydrates in the diet that will affect it. And also things like exercise, which is largely completely the wild, wild west in the context of type 1 diabetes, which is this idea that almost it's one of the biggest problems right now is how do people get normal glycemic control during exercise? And the vast majority of people don't. It's actually the hardest problem. And there's a lot of research funding being just thrown at this problem to say, how do we fix this? Using tools and technologies that help people just plug and play. But the
Yeah, and I
reality is
know
that
you have another study coming out that may help us with some of these things with the reactive hyperglycemia and all these things. So I'm all ears and waiting to see what tricks, little things we can do to help with some of that hyperglycemia response or whatever it may be, just to balance things out as much as possible.
yeah, and ultimately you bring up a term. If someone were to ask me, hey, Andrew, what do you believe is the one term that could define health if you could only use one word? And I'd say the most appropriate term I can give, if I only got one word to use, is balance. Ultimately finding balance is very hard. It's very difficult. It's not easy, and many of us fail, especially in the fields we're in, to find such a thing, as particularly in life. But that said, it is important, and finding it in whatever context is balance for you is going to be critical to managing disease, to improving health, and ultimately improving performance. A lot of people think extremes are what get people to the elite level performance. And the reality is that these elite level athletes, if you just use them as an example, are often finding balance within their progressive routine to allow them to respond optimally such that they can progress over time and become what appears to be extreme, but they never went from zero to elite. They have been progressing over time in a balanced manner to
Mm.
optimize the recovery and response in order to become to that level. So don't walk into this, just like when you talk about the patient with type 1, don't walk into the diagnosis thinking, I'm just going to, this is going to be the easiest road ever. And I'm just going to be able to hit this out of the park. No, like it's going to be a learned journey, and you're going to need to just understand it's worth it. It's going to be hard, but it'll be worth it. The disease doesn't get easier, but you get smarter and you get stronger. And as a result, it empowers you to be able to apply tools and strategies to make everything way easier. And I would argue that in many contexts, less is more.
Awesome. Are there any resources you go, look, here's something that I would recommend if you're going to just read one thing? Is there something that you would recommend reading for a newly diagnosed type 1 or their family?
Well, I would actually point them to a video I did, a TED talk I did back in 2018, because they're already going to get information on everything revolving standard of care upon diagnosis. So they're already going to have that, but they're probably not going to be informed in strategies that may allow them to maybe get into this top 1%. So I would reference them to a 15-minute video. Um,
Awesome.
and,
Can you
and
send me the link and we'll link it on the show
yes,
notes?
yep,
And then
absolutely.
how, if people want to track you down, where's the best way to track you down?
So I have a website that I'm actually in the process of updating right now to provide way more resources for patients on their lived experience to try to help everyone who is interested to get into that top 1% and to achieve that elite level performance. I believe everyone can if they have the resources and know what they're doing. And that's Andrew Koutnik andrewkoutnik.com, AndrewKoutnik.com. That's being expanded and should be updated in maybe by early November. I'm also on Twitter. I do engage a bit on that. My handle is my first initial A and then my last name, Koutnik, Koutnik. I have Instagram, and I just started a TikTok to try to, again, get more information out there for patients who are looking for evidence-based information on how to improve their, not only if you by chance have diabetes and want to improve your disease management, but if you're an elite level athlete looking to get that top 1%. I'm going to try to put more and more information out there. I believe that's important to bridge that gap as a scientist, not just to sit back in a lab and do research that no one understands when you publish it, or understands, frankly, the vast majority of this complex science is out there. But I'm working to demystify that and help people understand how to translate complex science and complex medical diseases ultimately to real actionable, tangible things that they can do with their life.
Awesome, man. And I got to ask you, what's life's best medicine for you? For Andrew
So,
Koutnik, what's life's best medicine? Where do you go when things are hard? What keeps you motivated? What keeps you moving forward?
you know, it actually isn't nutrition or exercise or lifestyle. It's actually a level of groundedness. I'm a big believer in mindfulness and meditation. I have found that that has been one of the most important. Not necessarily, it's a tool for sure, but I actually have found that having internal awareness of how your mind works and how you can actually um, manage it is probably the one of the most important things I've ever learned in my entire life. And I so I would actually say that having an awareness of how your mind works at its core and even at a subconscious level, which a lot of people only realize when they do something like guided meditation, is really profound in that. And I would also add to that that I feel that for people who are unaware of these strategies and techniques, one way of just thinking about this is just realizing the locus of control in your life is inside of you. And if you believe that your external world is basically in control of everything you do or who you are, then of course everything around you will control who you are. But if you realize that you actually contain the power within to be able to control and regulate your life, that it can be one of the most powerful realizations you have, and that then can empower people to take on the journey for nutrition, take on the journey for exercise, and take on the path to live their best and healthiest life.
Man, awesome advice all around. And everyone, like I say, be kind to yourself, be kind to others. Dr. Koutnik here, I saw him engaging with people at conferences, wanting to help people, like just giving of his time and his brain energy and life experience and clinical experience as far as from research standpoint. It's pretty amazing, like what you're doing. I'm excited. I'm like the whole time we're talking, I'm thinking, I want you as a health coach of my type ones. I want you to go to health coaching school and just like we work together and help people. It'll be amazing. And there's such a huge need out there. And so I'll put that in your little brain to think about over time.
I'm very open to such a thing. I do understand that there's very few people out there that actually know um, not only the lived experience with type 1 diabetes, how to apply it to achieve the type 1% from an exercise perspective and beyond. But that gets back to this idea of demystifying this complex, biology and physiology to apply it to understand why these changes are occurring, so that each person on an individual level can ultimately look to optimize their personal health. Because again, understanding why am I feeling this way under this context? Well, if you understand the underlying cause of it, you can then find tools and strategies to fill that gap. And so either way, yeah, no, I'm very open to people are looking for help or trying to receive guidance in some respect. That's why I'm trying to make the website, is to provide more of that to as many people as possible.
Yeah, awesome. And thanks so much for taking the time to join me. I know we went long, everyone, but this is really important. And we're going to have a couple more episodes on here at Low Carb MD and talk about what you're doing, life experience, because it's critically important. Doctors are afraid of type 1 diabetics. They won't even see them a lot of times, and there's a huge need. So what you're doing, it's amazing, and it gives hope to people. So I'm so glad you joined me. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. And if people don't actually know or have never met Brian, he is as awesome as he seems here. He is an amazingly kind and wonderful human being who also gives a tremendous amount of his time to others. And I saw that immediately the first time I ever met him in person. So he is the man, and it's an honor to be here to get to speak with him.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it. I'm going to play that back for my wife if she gets upset with me. So
That's amazing.
thanks. Thank you for listening to this episode. We greatly appreciate your support. We would greatly appreciate a positive thumbs up on all of the platforms like iTunes and Spotify or wherever you're listening. And we just thank you for our Patreon supporters. We greatly appreciate your help in getting this message out. We think there's a lot of important information, and hopefully this helps you. Have a great day, and thank you for listening, and thank you for your support.